$50 million reduced to ashes was the ultimate price for a single vicious whisper. When socialite Victoria leaned in, maliciously telling the underworld's most brilliant financial queen she was simply too big for a mafia king, she crossed a lethal line. She explicitly signed her own brutal death warrant. Skylar Hayes never apologized for the space she took up in a room. In a clandestine underworld dominated by razor-thin trophy wives, silicone enhancements, and men who viewed women as easily interchangeable accessories. Skylar was an anomaly. She was a deeply fat woman, possessing a lush, unapologetic figure that commanded attention the second her Louboutins clicked against marble floors. But her weight wasn't the only thing that made her formidable. She possessed the sharpest financial mind on the eastern seaboard. Skylar ran the Velvet Ledger, an ultra-exclusive, completely off-the-books banking system that washed millions of dollars for the most dangerous cartels, syndicates, and corrupt politicians in the country. People didn't just respect Skylar, they feared her. She held the account numbers, the offshore routing codes, and the buried secrets of every powerful man from New York to Miami. Yet despite her terrifying influence, the social politics of the Mafia wives' circle remained agonizingly shallow. Behind their manicured hands, the wives of underbosses and capos would whisper. They sneered at her size, unable to comprehend how a woman who wore a size 22 could wield more power than all of their husbands combined. Lorenzo Costa didn't care about the whispers. As the newly crowned head of the Costa Syndicate, Lorenzo was a man carved from ice and violence. He was devastatingly handsome, possessing dark, calculating eyes that missed absolutely nothing. When his father was assassinated, Lorenzo took control of the family empire with a ruthless efficiency that left the streets painted in blood. But behind the iron fist of his reign was a quiet, consuming obsession. An obsession with Skylar. Their relationship was an unspoken, highly guarded secret. To the outside world, they were strictly business associates. Skylar managed the Costa family's illicit wealth, ensuring that millions in racketeering money came out looking like legitimate real estate investments. But behind the reinforced steel doors of Lorenzo's penthouse, the dynamic shifted entirely. Lorenzo worshipped her. He worshipped the soft curve of her hips, the sharp bite of her intellect, and the way she never flinched when he walked into a room covered in another man's blood. To Lorenzo, Skylar wasn't just beautiful. She was a goddess, sitting on a throne of dirty money. But secrecy breeds opportunists. Enter Victoria Hastings. Victoria was the heir to Hastings' heritage, a global luxury PR and modeling empire that catered to the ultra-rich. She was everything society deemed perfect, tall, statuesque blonde, and devastatingly thin. Victoria was also completely devoid of a moral compass. For years, she had been using her high-fashion import channels to smuggle conflict diamonds and military-grade weaponry for the Volkov Bratva, a fierce rival of the Costa family. Victoria had her eyes set on Lorenzo Costa. In her twisted, arrogant mind, taking Lorenzo as a husband would solidify her as the undisputed queen of the city. She believed a man of Lorenzo's stature required a woman who looked like her on his arm, a beautiful, fragile-looking bird, to offset his violent nature. She viewed Skylar as nothing more than an oversized bookkeeper, a glorified secretary whom Lorenzo tolerated solely out of financial necessity. The tension had been brewing for months. Victoria made it a point to undermine Skylar at every high society gala, charity auction, and underground casino opening. She would offer passive-aggressive comments about Skylar's diet, accidentally spill champagne on Skylar's custom-made dresses, and loudly wonder why Lorenzo didn't hire a more presentable face for his front companies. Skylar, a woman who regularly negotiated truces between warring cartels, usually let the petty insults slide off her back like water. She knew her worth. She knew what happened in Lorenzo's bed, and she knew the exact net worth of Victoria's heavily leveraged company. But the constant chipping away at her physical appearance tapped into an old, deeply buried vulnerability. Growing up heavy in a world that demanded thinness had left scars, and Victoria knew exactly how to press her perfectly manicured nails right into those old wounds. The tipping point arrived in mid-December at the clandestine Winter Solstice Gala, hosted at the Valenti Estate, a sprawling, fortified mansion in the snow-covered hills of upstate New York. It was the premier event of the underworld, a place where multi-million-dollar drug routes were negotiated over beluga caviar and vintage champagne. Skylar arrived looking nothing short of breathtaking. She wore a custom-tailored, deep emerald velvet gown that plunged at the neckline and hugged every lush curve of her body. Rubies rested against her collarbones, a silent gift from Lorenzo that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. As she glided down the grand staircase, conversations paused. Lorenzo stood across the ballroom, flanked by his terrifying lieutenants, Gregory and Vincent. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, swirling amber liquid in a crystal glass. When his eyes locked onto Skylar, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The possessive dark hunger in his gaze was unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. But Victoria Hastings wasn't paying attention to Lorenzo's eyes. She was only paying attention to her own bruised ego. Victoria had spent the entire evening trying to corner Lorenzo, leveraging her European fashion contacts to propose a mutually beneficial partnership. Lorenzo had dismissed her with barely a glance, his attention perpetually drifting back to the emerald-clad woman holding court near the high-stakes baccarat tables. Humiliated and fueled by an expensive cocktail of cocaine and arrogance, Victoria decided that if she couldn't win Lorenzo's attention with business, she would systematically destroy the woman holding it. Around midnight, Skylar excused herself to the estate's sprawling East Wing powder room to reapply her lipstick. The room was a lavish display of gold leaf mirrors and rose-colored marble. As Skylar leaned over the sink, blotting a deep crimson color onto her lips, the heavy oak door clicked shut and locked. Victoria stood leaning against the doorframe, a venomous, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She looked like a runway model, wrapped in silver sequins, but her eyes held the malice of a starving predator. "You look exhausted, Penny," Victoria purred, stepping further into the room. She deliberately looked Skylar up and down, her gaze lingering on the swell of Skylar's stomach and the curve of her thighs beneath the velvet. "Carrying all that weight around, all night. It must be terrible for your joints." Skylar didn't flinch. She capped her lipstick, slipped it into her clutch, and met Victoria's gaze through the reflection of the mirror. "Victoria, if you're looking for another line of credit to float your failing winter collection, my office hours are Monday through Friday. Right now, you're interrupting my evening." Victoria's smile tightened, her perfectly contoured cheeks flushing with sudden anger. "Your office, please. Don't act like you're anything more than a glorified accountant who eats her feelings. Do you honestly think anyone here respects you? Do you think Lorenzo respects you?" Skylar turned around, slowly crossing her arms over her chest. "I think Lorenzo respects the $80 million I laundered for him last quarter. Now step out of my way." Victoria didn't move. Instead, she took a step closer, invading Skylar's personal space. The scent of her expensive floral perfume was nauseatingly strong. "He uses you, Skylar, because you're smart with numbers. But don't ever confuse utility with desire." Victoria leaned in her voice, dropping to a harsh, jagged whisper, meant to inflict maximum damage. "Look in the mirror. Look at yourself and then look at me. Men like Lorenzo Costa conquer the world. They want a prize on their arm. You You're too big for him. You're too fat to ever be anything more than the dirty little secret he keeps in the basement." Silence suffocated the powder room. For a fraction of a second, the words hit exactly where Victoria intended. A brief flash of pain flickered behind Skylar's eyes. It was the eternal exhausting cruelty of a world that refused to see her brilliance because it was too busy judging her circumference. But Skylar was not a victim. She straightened her spine, her expression morphing into a mask of pure, terrifying authority. "Are you finished?" Skylar asked, her voice dangerously calm. Before Victoria could fire back another insult, a heavy thud echoed from the adjoining sitting room, the private VIP lounge connected to the powder room. The connecting door, which had been slightly ajar, swung open. Lorenzo Costa stepped out of the shadows. He didn't look angry. He looked completely violently hollow, the kind of emotionless calm that usually preceded a massacre. He had stepped into the adjoining room minutes earlier to take a private call, and he had heard every single word. Victoria gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. Her face drained of all color, the silver sequins of her dress suddenly looking like armor that was far too thin. "Lorenzo Chaim, I didn't know you were in there." Lorenzo didn't look at Victoria. His dark, dangerous eyes went straight to Skylar. He saw the slight tightening of her jaw, the defensive posture of her shoulders. He saw the woman he loved, the woman who held his empire together, with her bare hands being reduced to an ugly high school insult by a woman who wasn't worthy to breathe the same air. "Skylar," Lorenzo's voice was a low, rough rumble. "Wait for me by the cars." Skylar held his gaze for a long moment. She saw the lethal promise burning in his irises. She didn't argue. She picked up her clutch, walked right past a trembling Victoria without a second glance, and exited the room. Once the door clicked shut behind her, Lorenzo finally turned his attention to the blonde heiress. Victoria tried to force a seductive smile, desperately attempting to salvage the situation. "Lorenzo, darling, you have to understand. I was just giving her some friendly." Lorenzo closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides. He didn't hit her. He didn't touch her. He simply crowded her into the marble sink, towering over her until she was forced to lean back against the cold mirror, gasping for air. "Hastings Heritage." Lorenzo whispered, his voice dangerously soft. 16 warehouses down by the docks, 2 flagship stores in Manhattan, a global distribution network heavily leveraged by offshore loans from the Volkov family. Victoria's breath hitched. Her eyes widened in absolute terror. How do you... "You think you're untouchable because you're thin?" Lorenzo asked, a dark, mocking smirk twisting his lips. "You think bone structure protects you from a bullet? Skylar owns your debt, Victoria. She bought it 3 weeks ago. She owns your warehouses. She owns your flagship stores. I let her do it because she thought it was good business." Lorenzo leaned in until his mouth was inches from Victoria's ear. "But I don't care about business anymore. You insulted my queen, and now you're going to watch your entire empire burn to the fucking ground." Lorenzo stepped back, adjusting his cuffs with terrifying nonchalance. "Get your coat, Victoria. The night is about to get very, very cold for you." As Lorenzo walked out of the powder room, leaving Victoria sobbing hysterically against the marble sink, a terrifying sequence of events was already being set into motion. Lorenzo pulled his burner phone from his pocket, dialing his most ruthless Lieutenant Vincent. "Vincent," Lorenzo commanded, his voice echoing through the opulent halls of the estate. "Round up the men. Bring the gasoline. We are going to erase Hastings Heritage from the face of the earth tonight." Gasoline poured over imported French silk creates a distinct, sickeningly sweet odor right before the first spark catches. Down by the industrial waterfront of Brooklyn, 16 heavily fortified warehouses owned by Hastings Heritage stood silently in the freezing December night. Inside those corrugated steel walls rested the entirety of Victoria's heavily leveraged empire, millions of dollars, in haute couture, garments, crates of smuggled blood diamonds from Sierra Leone, and untraceable military-grade hardware destined for the Volkov Bratva. Vincent Lorenzo's most lethal enforcer stood near the loading docks in a tailored charcoal overcoat, watching his crew meticulously douse the perimeter. He checked the glowing dial of his Audemars Piguet chronograph. It was exactly 2 a.m. A secure line buzzed in his earpiece. Lorenzo's voice, cold and devoid of mercy, delivered a single word: ignite. Vincent flicked his gold DuPont lighter, letting the flame dance for a fraction of a second before tossing it onto the soaked concrete. Fire roared to life with the force of a detonating bomb. The flames scaled the sides of the buildings, shattering reinforced glass and devouring the roof lines. Sirens began to wail in the distance, but the local precincts were firmly on the Costa family payroll. The fire trucks would inexplicably take the longest possible routes, ensuring nothing but ash remained by the time they arrived. Miles away, in her sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park, Victoria awoke to the shrill ringing of her private encrypted cell phone. Her hands trembled as she snatched it from the marble nightstand. It was her head of security. "Miss Hastings!" the man barked over the chaotic sound of roaring flames and collapsing steel. "The Brooklyn depositories, all of them. They're gone. The crew was heavily armed professional. We lost everything." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. The phone slipped from her manicured fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized her chest. She sprinted to her home office, ripping open her laptop to access her offshore corporate accounts at Credit Suisse and the Cayman National Bank. If she could just liquidate her emergency shadow funds, she could appease the Volkovs for the lost weapons and flee to Europe on a chartered NetJets flight before Lorenzo could find her. Her perfectly contoured face fell in sheer, unadulterated horror as the banking portal loaded. Account frozen. Asset seizure in progress. Contact beneficiary, the Velvet Ledger. "No!" Victoria gasped frantically, slamming her manicured nails against the keyboard. "No, no, no." She dialed the direct line to her private wealth manager at UBS in Geneva. The phone rang 6 times before a tired voice answered. "Victoria, you shouldn't be calling this line. Not after tonight." "What did you do?" Victoria screamed, her high society poise completely shattering. "Where are my funds, who authorized a seizure without my biometric clearance?" "You leveraged your entire supply chain against loans from shell corporations," Victoria the banker replied, his tone laced with pity and fear. "Those shell companies were subsidiaries of the Velvet Ledger. When the collateral your warehouses burned down an hour ago, the smart contracts triggered an immediate automated margin call. Skylar Hayes executed the clauses. She owns your liquid assets, your personal real estate, your flagship stores, everything. You are bankrupt, Victoria. Do not call this number again." The line went dead. Victoria collapsed into her leather executive chair, sobbing hysterically. The harsh reality crashed down upon her. Skylar hadn't just been managing the Costa family's money. Skylar had been actively weaving a financial web around Victoria's business for months, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to snap the trap shut. Victoria had foolishly mistaken Skylar's silence for weakness, her heavy figure for a lack of discipline, completely blind to the fact that she was dealing with an apex predator. Desperation breeds reckless decisions. Victoria grabbed her coat, sprinting down to the underground parking garage to retrieve her Aston Martin. She had one last lifeline: Alexander Volkov. If she could reach the Russian syndicate leader at his private club in Tribeca, She could offer him the Costa family's operational secrets in exchange for protection and a loan. She drove erratically through the empty, snow-dusted streets of Manhattan, running red lights until she violently screeched to a halt outside the heavily guarded doors of the Volkov Club. She threw her keys at a bewildered valet and stormed past the massive bouncers who oddly made no move to stop her. Victoria burst into the VIP lounge, her blonde hair disheveled, her sequined dress torn at the hem. Alexander Volkov sat in a plush leather booth surrounded by his lieutenants. But he wasn't alone. Sitting across from the terrifying Russian mobster, calmly sipping a glass of Macallan 25, was Skylar. She was still wearing the breathtaking emerald velvet gown, her lush curves draped elegantly over the booth's upholstery. She looked perfectly relaxed, the picture of absolute, unbothered authority. Behind her stood Lorenzo, his hand resting possessively on the back of Skylar's neck, his dark eyes tracking Victoria like a sniper locking onto a target. "Alexander, please," Victoria sobbed, throwing herself toward the table. "They burned my shipments. They took my money. You have to protect me. I can give you Lorenzo's shipping manifests. I can—" Volkov raised a massive, heavily tattooed hand, silencing her instantly. He didn't look angry. He looked amused. He glanced at Skylar. "Is this the woman who called you Fat Tichka?" Skylar took a slow, deliberate sip of her whiskey, her crimson lips leaving a perfect imprint on the crystal glass. "That's the one, Alexander. Though considering she currently has a net worth of negative $40 million, her opinions hold significantly less weight than they did an hour ago." Volkov let out a booming laugh that rattled the glasses on the table. He looked back at Victoria with absolute disdain. "You arrogant, stupid girl. Skylar just restructured my cartel's entire European money laundering pipeline through Deutsche Bank. She saved me millions in federal luxury taxes. You lost my weapons in a fire. Why would I protect a bankrupt liability when I am doing business with a financial genius?" Victoria fell to her knees right there in the VIP lounge. The cold, hard floor of the club bruised her kneecaps, but she barely felt it. She was completely surrounded by monsters, and she had just realized she had mocked the queen who controlled them all. "Lorenzo." Victoria begged, tears ruining her expensive makeup, leaving black tracks down her cheeks. "Please, have mercy. I'll leave the country. I'll disappear." Lorenzo stepped out from behind the booth. He walked slowly toward Victoria, his polished leather shoes stopping inches from her trembling hands. He stared down at her, not with anger, but with absolute disgust. "You told Skylar she was too big for me," Lorenzo murmured, his voice a lethal vibrating bass that sent chills down the spines of every hardened criminal in the room. "You thought my empire required a fragile, starving ornament to stand beside me. You failed to understand that a king doesn't want a porcelain doll. A king requires an equal, someone who can hold the weight of the crown without breaking." Lorenzo crouched down, forcing Victoria to meet his gaze. "Skylar is my empire. She is the blood in the veins of the Costa family. And you are nothing but ash. Run, Victoria. Run far away, because if I ever see your face in this city again, I will not be as forgiving as the fire." The penthouse was eerily quiet when Lorenzo and Skylar finally returned. The sprawling duplex overlooking the glittering skyline of Manhattan was a sanctuary of dark wood, imported Italian marble, and bulletproof floor-to-ceiling windows. Skylar kicked off her Louboutins, sighing as her bare feet hit the plush Persian rug. The adrenaline of the night was finally beginning to ebb, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion. She walked over to the massive mahogany bar, pouring herself a splash of sparkling water. She could feel Lorenzo's eyes on her, heavy and constant. He moved silently across the room, wrapping his large, warm hands around her waist from behind. He pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled deeply, breathing in the scent of her expensive vanilla perfume. "You were magnificent tonight," Lorenzo whispered against her skin, his lips pressing a soft kiss just below her jawline. "Watching you dismantle that pathetic woman's life with a few keystrokes. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Skylar leaned back into his solid frame, her hands resting over his. Despite her fierce display of power at the club, the ugly words Victoria had hissed in the powder room still lingered like a shadow at the back of her mind. "You're too big for him. You're too fat to ever be anything more than the dirty little secret." "Lorenzo." Skylar started her voice, unusually quiet. She turned in his arms, looking up into his dark, searching eyes. "What she said tonight, about how society views us, about how men in your position are expected to have a certain type of woman." Lorenzo's expression hardened instantly. He didn't let her finish. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently sweeping across her cheekbones. "Do not let the venom of a ruined woman poison your mind, Skylar," Lorenzo said fiercely. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then down to the deep plunge of her velvet dress, taking in the full, lush curves of her body with undisguised reverence. "I despise the fragile plastic women in our circle. I despise their empty conversations and their hollow ambitions. I crave you, every soft inch of you, your brilliant mind, your ruthless heart, and a body that actually feels like a woman when I hold her." He kissed her, then a deep, consuming kiss that tasted of Scotch danger and absolute devotion. Skylar melted into the embrace, the last remnants of her insecurity burning away under the heat of his touch. He worshipped her form, his hands mapping the curves of her hips, silently reinforcing everything his words had just promised. She wasn't a secret. She was the undisputed Donna of the Costa family. The next morning, the financial world of New York woke up to a seismic shift. The headlines of the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg reported the sudden, catastrophic collapse of Hastings' heritage. The narrative fed to the public was a tragic tale of over-leveraged assets and a devastating warehouse fire caused by faulty industrial wiring. Victoria Hastings was spotted boarding a commercial flight to a small coastal town in South America, her designer luggage replaced by 2 modest duffel bags, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. She had been erased from the elite social registry overnight. 6 months later, the Costa Syndicate hosted the highly anticipated Summer Solstice Gala at the Pierre Hotel in Manhattan. It was an event designed to project absolute dominance over the city's underworld. The grand ballroom was packed with politicians, judges, and the heads of rival families, all eager to pay their respects to Lorenzo. The whispers that usually permeated the room were entirely absent. Everyone had heard the ghost stories of what happened to Victoria Hastings. Everyone knew who held the real power behind the Costa throne. The massive gilded doors of the ballroom swung open. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. Lorenzo walked in, dressed in a flawless midnight blue tuxedo. But he wasn't walking ahead of his entourage. He was walking shoulder to shoulder with Skylar. She wore a custom, breathtaking gown made of spun gold that clung unapologetically to her heavy, lush figure. She radiated confidence, diamonds glittering at her throat, her head held high. Lorenzo did not hide her in the shadows. He proudly escorted her to the center of the room, his hand resting firmly on the swell of her waist. As the most powerful men in the country lined up to kiss her hand and beg for favorable interest rates on their illicit loans, Skylar smiled. She had built an empire on numbers, washed their blood-stained money, and conquered the man who conquered the city. She took up space, fiercely and unapologetically, proving once and for all that, In a world of ruthless kings, the woman holding the ledger always wears the heaviest crown. Did you love this story of mafia, revenge, high stakes, financial warfare, and unapologetic romance? If you want to hear more, dark, dramatic stories where the brilliant mastermind outsmarts the toxic villains and claims her rightful throne, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your fellow romance lovers, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next thrilling underworld drama. Your support helps us create more amazing stories.